What if the people sworn to protect you were the ones pulling the strings? What if justice wasn't about right or wrong, but about power? One journalist dared to uncover the truth. Now, she's running for her life. They tried to silence her. They failed. But the deeper she digs, the clearer it becomes. Langston was just the beginning. Because in this game, the real power stays hidden. And they're watching. Right now. Are you? Chapter 1. The Quiet Life Shattered. Zara Mitchell had always known the dangers of digging too deep. But knowledge and experience were two different things. As a journalist in a small southern town, she had spent years exposing the cracks in the system, minor corruptions, mishandled cases, occasional abuses of power, nothing big enough to draw real blood, nothing that made her fear for her life. That changed the evening she got the tip about Terry Langston. The town of Brooksville wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It was the kind of town where people still nodded to each other on the street. Where the diner knew how you took your coffee. Where the local paper had more obituaries than breaking news. It was also the kind of town where power sat in the same hands for decades. Where police officers became judges. And where the wrong person asking the wrong questions could find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Langston had been sheriff for over 20 years. People whispered about him in low voices. About the cases that disappeared. The families that left town without a word. But no one ever did anything. Not because they didn't care, because they knew better. That afternoon, Zara had met with an old contact. Someone who had worked inside the department before suddenly quitting and leaving town for good. The man's hands had trembled as he passed her a flash drive. His eyes darting like a man who expected to be watched. "You didn't get this from me," he had said. The drive contained a collection of reports, names, and timelines. Cases of excessive force, missing complaints, deaths labeled as accidents but showing clear signs of brutality. And all of it led back to Langston. Zara sat at her desk, staring at the screen, the weight of what she had in her hands settling deep in her chest. Exposing this wasn't the same as reporting on minor corruption. This was a direct challenge to the most powerful man in town. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. She could dig deeper. She could cross-check records, find witnesses. But then what? If she published, what would happen? Would anyone care enough to fight? Or would it just put a target on her back? Outside, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows through the blinds. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. Untouched, she exhaled, rubbing her temples, then closed her laptop. It could wait until morning. The drive home was quiet. The streets were nearly empty. The houses dark. Brooksville shut down early, the way small towns did. Halfway through the drive, she noticed the headlights in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't think much of it. Just another car headed the same way. But when she turned onto a quieter street, the headlights followed. She tested it, took an unnecessary left, then a right onto a side road. The car did the same. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. It was a patrol car. Her heart picked up speed. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe she was imagining things. But then the blue and red lights flashed once. Not a full siren, just a quick warning. A message. She swallowed hard and kept driving, forcing herself to stay calm. The patrol car didn't pull her over, didn't attempt to stop her. It just followed, block after block, keeping its presence known. When she finally turned onto her street, it slowed at the intersection, idling there long enough for her to see the silhouette of the man inside. Terry Langston. Then, without a word, the lights flicked off, and the car disappeared into the night. Zara sat in her driveway for a long time, hands still gripping the wheel. Chapter 2. The First Confrontation. Zara had spent the night tossing and turning, the image of Langston's patrol car lingering in her mind. It wasn't just a warning, it was a message, a reminder that she wasn't untouchable. By morning, she had convinced herself that maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it had been a coincidence, a late-night patrol on an empty road. But as she pulled out of her driveway, a creeping sense of unease followed her like a shadow. She took the long route to work, past the coffee shop where the owner always greeted her by name, past the park where retirees played chess under the shade of towering oaks. The town looked the same as it always had, quiet, predictable, unchanged, but something about it felt different now. like an unseen weight pressing against her chest. Halfway down Main Street, a sharp flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her stomach tighten. She pulled over, fingers clenching the wheel as she watched the patrol car stop behind her. The door opened slowly, deliberately, and out stepped Langston. He moved like a man who had never been questioned, never had to explain himself. His uniform was crisp, his belt weighed down with authority. Gun, radio, handcuffs, all tools of control. He took his time walking up to her window, leaning down just enough so she had to look up at him. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," he said, voice smooth, almost friendly. "You in a hurry?" Zara forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I wasn't speeding." Langston smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That so?" He tapped the roof of her car with 2 fingers. "Your brake light's out. That's a safety issue." Zara glanced in the mirror. Her brake lights were fine when she left home. "I'll get it checked," she said. Langston tilted his head, studying her. "You know, I read your latest article." He let the words hang between them, heavy with meaning. She didn't answer. "Got me thinking," he continued, resting a hand on the edge of her door. "You spend a lot of time digging into things that ain't your business. Writing about matters you don't fully understand." Zara met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Holding people accountable is my business." Langston let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That's cute. You think you're making a difference? That you're some kind of crusader?" He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "You're just poking a bear, sweetheart. And that bear don't like being poked." A flicker of movement caught Zara's eye. Across the street, Marcus Reed stood outside his barbershop, phone in hand, pointing the camera directly at them. Langston noticed too. His jaw tensed, but he didn't turn to acknowledge Marcus. Instead, he straightened, brushing non-existent dust from his uniform. "Well," he said, stepping back, "since I'm feeling generous, I'll let you off with a warning." Zara's pulse pounded in her ears as she watched him retreat to his car. He paused at the door, glancing back one last time. "You should learn when to walk away," he murmured, "before you get yourself hurt." Then he was gone, his patrol car merging back into traffic like nothing had happened. Zara exhaled, gripping the steering wheel to steady herself. Across the street, Marcus lowered his phone, his expression unreadable. Chapter 3. The Shadow and the Trap. At first, Zara thought she was imagining things. The feeling of being watched had started the night Langston tailed her home. But now it was something more. It was a presence, constant, lingering, just beyond her reach. The first sign came when she spotted the same white sedan parked down the street from her house. Its windows tinted too dark to make out the driver. It was there in the morning when she left for work. Still there when she got home. Never moving, never making itself obvious, but always there. At her office, a patrol car had started appearing just outside, parked for no clear reason. No officer ever came inside. No tickets were issued, no reports made. It simply sat there, an unspoken message. Then came the strangers. Men she didn't recognize loitering near the coffee shop she frequented. Lingering outside the grocery store. One morning, a man in a blue baseball cap stood across the street from her house, pretending to check his phone. But when she stepped outside, he quickly walked away. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning. Still, she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She had worked too hard for that. One evening, while scanning through her emails, she spotted a message with no sender name. Just a subject line. "You should see this." She hesitated for only a second before clicking. Inside was a single link leading to a private server. A folder titled Langston Files. Her pulse quickened as she clicked through. The documents were brief but damning. Internal reports of brutality complaints, evidence tampering, unfiled arrests. One file mentioned a name she recognized, Raymond Carter, a former officer who had mysteriously left the force years ago. Then, just as she was about to download the files, the screen flickered, the folder vanished. A new message appeared. "You shouldn't have done that." Her stomach clenched. She tried refreshing the page. Nothing. The email was gone too. Deleted. Someone had been watching her in real time. The next morning, the pressure intensified. Calls to her sources went unanswered. One of them, a clerk at the courthouse who had always been willing to leak minor documents, Sent her a short text. Don't contact me again. A few hours later, she heard from another source, except this time. It wasn't to help her. It was to warn her. Langston was making moves. By the time she arrived at her office that afternoon, a uniformed officer was already waiting at her desk. His name tag read Walker. His stance stiff with authority. Miss Mitchell, he said, holding out a piece of paper. You need to come with me. Zara read the warrant. Unauthorized access to restricted records. Misuse of identification for investigative purposes. A cold realization settled in. They weren't trying to arrest her for anything real. They were trying to discredit her. She lifted her gaze to Officer Walker. You know this is nonsense. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. A few of her colleagues had started to notice. Their eyes darting toward her with hesitant curiosity. She could see it. Some of them wanted to speak up. But fear held them back. Zara exhaled slowly, then nodded. Let me get my things. Walker allowed it, stepping back just enough to let her grab her bag. She reached for her phone. But before she could send a message, he spoke again. I'll take that, he said, gesturing for the phone. She hesitated, but there was no point in resisting. She handed it over, her mind already racing for another way to contact someone on the outside. As she was led out of the office, the weight of what was happening fully sank in. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was an attempt to silence her. Later that night, after hours of questioning that led nowhere and a forced statement that she refused to sign, Zara was finally released. No formal charges were filed, yet. But the message had been delivered loud and clear. She stepped outside into the cold air, rubbing her wrists absent-mindedly, then reached for her spare phone. The one she kept hidden in her car for emergencies. She dialed Marcus Reed's number. The call rang once, twice, then it went to voicemail. She tried again. This time, he picked up, but his voice was tense. Hushed. Zara, you shouldn't have called me. Her heart sank. Marcus, I need to see you. A long pause. I can't, he said finally. Not anymore. Then the line went dead. Chapter 4. Buried Secrets. Zara sat in her car outside Ethan Carter's office, gripping the steering wheel as she gathered her thoughts. The building was old, its brick facade worn from years of southern humidity. But the man inside had built a reputation that was anything but fragile. Ethan Carter had been fighting civil rights cases long before Zara had picked up her first reporter's notebook. If anyone could help her, it was him. She stepped out, locking the car behind her, and climbed the short flight of stairs to his office. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, revealing a cramped but organized space. Case files covered every available surface. Their edges curled from constant handling. Ethan himself stood behind his desk, dark-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose. Flipping through paperwork, he glanced up as she entered, setting the files aside. I was expecting you, he said, motioning toward the chair opposite him. Zara hesitated for a second before sitting down. Then you probably know why I'm here. Ethan sighed, rubbing his forehead. Word travels fast in this town, especially when it involves Sheriff Langston. You've kicked a hornet's nest. Zara. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. I have proof. A pattern of cover-ups. Disappearances. Falsified reports. But I need help making it stick. They just tried to frame me with that fake charge. What happens next? Ethan exhaled slowly, removing his glasses. What happens next is worse. Zara frowned. Worse? You don't understand what you're dealing with, he said. Langston isn't just another corrupt cop. He's protected. He's been in power too long. And the people who keep him there aren't the type to let someone like you come along and undo decades of work. She stiffened. Someone like me? A journalist who doesn't know when to stop. His tone wasn't condescending. Just tired, like a man who had seen this play out before. Zara shook her head. I can't just drop it. Ethan studied her for a moment before nodding. I didn't think you would. He scribbled something on a notepad and tore off the sheet. Here's a number, a contact of mine. He knows things about Langston that aren't on any file. She took the paper and tucked it into her jacket. Thank you. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. Be careful, Zara. This is bigger than you realize. By the time she stepped outside, the sky had darkened. The air was thick with the promise of rain. the scent of wet asphalt clinging to the evening breeze. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed. A news alert. She tapped the screen, and Langston's face filled it. He stood at a podium, the American flag draped behind him, speaking into a row of microphones. Misinformation designed to undermine the integrity of this department. He said, "These baseless accusations are an insult to the hardworking men and women who keep this town safe." Zara clenched her jaw. Langston wasn't just denying her claims, he was turning the entire town against her. She threw the car into drive and pulled away, her heart hammering in her chest. If he was making this public, it meant he was escalating. And that meant she was getting too close. Later that night, parked a block away from the sheriff's station, Zara adjusted the small camera lens attached to her phone. She had been here for nearly an hour, watching, waiting. Then, finally, movement. Langston emerged from the station. But he wasn't alone. 3 men walked beside him, their conversation hushed. She snapped a few photos. Zooming in, the men were dressed in civilian clothes. But something about them felt off. They carried themselves with the quiet authority of people used to being in control. Langston led them toward an alleyway beside the building, where the shadows swallowed them whole. Zara's pulse quickened. Whatever they were discussing, they didn't want it overheard. She slipped out of her car, keeping to the darkness, and moved closer. As she neared the alley, voices drifted toward her. One was Langston's, the other, sharper, more commanding. "I don't care how you do it," the second man said, "just handle the problem before it gets worse." Langston's response was too low to catch, but it was clear who was giving the orders. A chill ran through Zara. Langston wasn't at the top of the food chain. He was taking orders. She pressed herself against the brick wall, listening as footsteps moved away. Once they were gone, she exhaled shakily. This was bigger than she thought. Much bigger. At home, she booted up her laptop and inserted a flash drive, the one she had taken from Langston's office months ago but never fully examined. She clicked through folders, scanning hastily labeled files. Most were standard reports, until she found one titled Discretionary Funds. Her stomach knotted. Opening it, she skimmed pages of expense logs, falsified invoices, redirected payments. But it wasn't the money that sent ice through her veins. It was the names. A network of officers, city officials, even a judge, all connected to Langston. Before she could process what it meant, a noise outside made her freeze. A shuffle of movement. She reached for her phone. But the power flickered. The room dimmed. Then came the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking from the outside. Someone was in the house. She moved quickly, shoving the flash drive into her pocket as she backed toward the hallway. The floor creaked behind her. She turned, and for a split second, she expected to see a cop, maybe even Langston himself. But the man standing there wasn't wearing a uniform. He was dressed in black, a tactical vest strapped across his chest, a pistol holstered at his hip. This wasn't a cop. This was a professional. Chapter 5. Escape from the trap. The second Zara saw the man in black, she moved. She didn't think. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She spun toward the hallway, heart pounding, feet barely touching the hardwood floor as she bolted toward the back door. Behind her, the intruder moved fast, a sharp grunt, the heavy thud of boots against the ground, and then the sound of something slicing through the air. She didn't have to look to know he had drawn a weapon. Zara lunged for the door handle, twisting it hard. Locked. A curse caught in her throat. She had locked it out of habit when she came in. No time to fumble with the deadbolt. A crash behind her. He was closing in. She pivoted, grabbed the nearest object, a ceramic lamp, and hurled it. The intruder ducked, but it shattered against his shoulder, buying her just enough time to throw her weight against the window beside the door. The glass exploded around her as she tumbled through, landing hard on the cold pavement outside. Shards scraped her arms, but she ignored the sting. Scrambling to her feet, a sharp whistle from inside. He was signaling someone. She didn't wait to find out who. She sprinted toward the alley behind her house, the narrow path leading to the main road. Every step sent jolts of pain through her knees, but she forced herself forward. The footsteps behind her never faltered. He was gaining. She ducked into a side alley, her breath coming fast. Ahead, an old chain link fence blocked her path, too high to climb in time. She spun, pressed herself against the wall, willing her body to disappear into the shadows. The man slowed, scanning the alley. He was trained. His head moved in calculated angles, his grip firm on the silenced pistol at his side. Zara didn't breathe. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, the man exhaled sharply and turned away. Moving down the alley, Zara waited 3 full heartbeats before slipping out and bolting in the opposite direction. She needed to disappear. The nearest safe place was 5 blocks away. A rundown warehouse she had once investigated for a story on abandoned properties. No one ever went there. She pushed forward, slipping into the night. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with dust and neglect. The dim light filtering through broken windows barely illuminated the rows of empty crates stacked against the walls. Zara crouched low behind one of them, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. No signal. A noise echoed from outside. Her stomach clenched. He had followed. His boots crunched against the gravel as he entered, moving with slow, deliberate steps. She peeked through a gap between the crates. He was closer than she expected. A tall, solid silhouette against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Zara pressed a hand against her mouth, biting down the panic rising in her chest. Then, another sound. Different. Engines. She recognized it instantly. Police sirens. A flash of red and blue lights flooded the warehouse entrance. The man stiffened. Then, without a word, he melted back into the shadows. Zara barely had time to process what was happening before a voice barked out. "Step out. Hands where I can see them." Zara's pulse hammered. She lifted her hands slowly, emerging from behind the crates. The officers fanned out, weapons drawn. Their faces were unreadable. For a brief, fleeting moment, relief coursed through her. Then she saw the man standing at the center of them. Terry Langston. He took a step forward, his lips curling into a slow, satisfied smile. "You just can't seem to stay out of trouble. Can you?" Zara opened her mouth, but before she could speak, he turned to the officers. "Book her. Trespassing. Interfering with an investigation." The cuffs clicked around her wrists. Langston leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "This is just the beginning." Chapter 6. The System's Wrath. Zara sat on the cold metal bench, staring at the crack in the concrete wall across from her. The air in the cell was thick, damp, carrying the stale scent of sweat and desperation. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, buzzing faintly, as if they too were tired of being here. She had been in holding cells before, waiting for sources, covering protests, documenting the stories of those the system tried to forget. But this was different. This time, she was the one behind bars. Langston had made sure she had no contact with the outside world. No phone call, no lawyer, just a lingering silence that pressed in from all sides. She had asked for Ethan Carter the moment she was booked, but the guards only smirked. "Not today," one of them had said, tapping the cell bars with his baton. Time blurred. She had no way of knowing if it was morning or night. At some point, a tray of food had been shoved through the slot in the door, something that barely resembled food. Cold and congealed, she hadn't touched it. Footsteps echoed down the hall. She sat up as 2 guards approached, both built like linebackers, their expressions unreadable. One unlocked the door while the other stepped inside. "You're coming with us," the taller one said. Zara hesitated. "Where?" The second guard cracked his knuckles. "You ask too many questions." Her gut twisted, but she forced herself to stay calm. She stood slowly, her muscles tense. The guards led her down a dimly lit corridor, past rows of other cells. Some were empty, others weren't. She caught glimpses of women watching her through the bars, their faces shadowed by the flickering lights. Some looked away quickly, others held her gaze, their expressions unreadable. As they reached an empty hallway, the grip on her arm tightened. Then, without warning, the taller guard shoved her hard against the wall. The impact sent a shockwave through her ribs. Before she could react, the other one grabbed a fistful of her shirt, yanking her forward before slamming her back against the concrete. Zara gasped, biting back a cry of pain. "You think you're special?" the taller one sneered. Think you can mess with people like Sheriff Langston and walk away? She met his gaze, refusing to look away. I think you're scared, she said, her voice steady. All of you. His jaw tightened. The second guard chuckled. She's got some fight in her. Zara braced herself for the next blow. But before it came, a voice cut through the hallway. Leave her. The guards froze. Zara turned her head, her heart pounding. A woman stood at the end of the hall, her face half hidden by the shadows. The guards exchanged glances, then released her without another word. The woman didn't speak again, just motioned for Zara to follow. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Back in the dimly lit common area, Zara sat across from the woman at a scratched-up metal table. You got a death wish, lady? The woman asked, her voice low. Zara studied her. Dark eyes, sharp features, tattoos peeking from the sleeves of her jumpsuit. There was something in her expression, something that wasn't quite concern. But wasn't indifference either. You seem to know something I don't, Zara said. The woman leaned back, arms crossed. I know they're not planning to let you walk out of here. Zara felt her stomach tighten. You think this is just a scare tactic? The woman continued. It's not. Langston owns half the people in this place. The ones he doesn't own? They look the other way. Zara swallowed hard. Then why are you talking to me? The woman shrugged. Maybe I don't like cops. Maybe I don't like bullies. She leaned forward. Or maybe I just think you deserve a chance. Zara's pulse quickened. I need to get a message out, she said quietly. The woman smirked. Already ahead of you. Hours passed before a guard finally came for her again. This time, she wasn't taken to another beating. She was taken to Ethan Carter. He sat on the other side of the glass. His suit slightly rumpled, his expression unreadable. Took you long enough, Zara muttered as she picked up the phone. Ethan exhaled. They didn't make it easy. He studied her for a moment. You okay? Zara glanced at the bruises forming along her wrists. I've had better days. He leaned in slightly. Listen to me. This isn't just Langston. He's got people on the inside. And they're all working to bury you. Zara's throat tightened. How bad is it? Ethan hesitated. The judge handling your case? A friend of Langston's. The prosecutor? Same story. You were never going to get a fair shot here. She gripped the phone tighter. Then what do we do? Before Ethan could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowned at the screen, then slowly stood. I have to take this, he said. Ethan. He gave her a look she couldn't quite read. Sit tight. Then he was gone. Zara sat there, gripping the receiver, watching as he disappeared through the door. Something was wrong. Chapter 7. An ally in the dark. Zara sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the last conversation with Ethan. Something had shifted. He had always been steady, always the kind of man who would fight to the bitter end. But now, the hesitation in his voice, the way he had avoided meeting her eyes, it had told her everything she needed to know. He was backing away, and that meant she was on her own. She exhaled, forcing herself to think. There had to be a way out of this. Someone who wasn't tangled up in Langston's web. A sharp knock at the bars made her flinch. She turned to see a female officer standing just outside her cell. Her uniform crisp, dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her badge read Lopez. The woman glanced down the hallway before stepping closer. Don't say anything, she muttered, just loud enough for Zara to hear. Zara stiffened. What do you? Lopez slipped a small piece of paper through the bars, pressing a finger to her lips before stepping away. She turned on her heel, walking off as if nothing had happened. Zara unfolded the note beneath the dim light. A phone number, scrawled hastily in ink. If you really want to live, remember this. Her pulse pounded in her ears. That night, they came for her. She had been dozing off, exhaustion pulling her under, when the heavy clang of her cell door jarred her awake. Two guards stood there, their faces unreadable. Time for a little walk, one of them said. Zara's gut twisted. This wasn't protocol. She hesitated, her mind racing, but she had no choice. If she resisted, they'd make it worse. They marched her down the dim corridor, past rows of empty cells. A door creaked open ahead, leading into a darker, windowless space. A maintenance room. Zara dug her heels into the floor. No, she said. I know what this is. The taller guard shoved her forward, knocking her off balance. Shut up. The door slammed behind them, locking her in with them. One of them cracked his knuckles. You think you're a hero? Zara clenched her fists. If you're going to kill me, at least admit what this is. She spat. The second guard chuckled. Not our call, but you can make this easy. Or we can make it hurt. She braced for the first blow. Then the door burst open. Cass Lopez moved fast. In the span of seconds, she had one guard pinned against the wall, her baton pressing against his throat. The other reached for his weapon. But before he could react, she swung her elbow into his ribs, sending him stumbling backward. Hands off, she snapped. The guards hesitated. Cass didn't. She pulled out her radio. Voice sharp. I need backup in holding 3. We've got a situation. The taller guard paled. Lopez, what the hell? You got caught, she said flatly. Get out. They exchanged a glance before backing away, disappearing through the door without another word. Zara exhaled, gripping the edge of the sink for support. Cass turned to her, eyes dark with something unreadable. You don't get it yet, do you? She said. That wasn't a scare tactic. That was them tying up loose ends. Zara swallowed hard. So why help me? Cass hesitated, then reached into her pocket and handed Zara a phone. Call the number. Zara's fingers shook as she dialed. The line rang twice before someone picked up. A deep, steady voice filled the silence. You don't have much time, the man said. If you want to make it out of this, you need to trust me. Zara's grip tightened around the phone. She had no other choice. Chapter 8. The Dangerous Escape. Zara gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The man on the other end spoke with a steady, measured tone. My name is Raymond Carter. I know what Langston is. And I know what he's done. But if you want to survive, you have to do exactly what I say. Zara hesitated. Why should I trust you? A short pause. Then Raymond exhaled. Because I used to be one of them. The line went dead. She stared at the phone, heart hammering. The name clicked into place. Raymond Carter. A former officer who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years ago. There were rumors he had been forced out, that he had gotten too close to something bigger than he could handle. Before she could process it further, Cass Lopez grabbed her wrist. We don't have time for doubts, she said. You want to get out of here or not? Zara nodded. Cass leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. There's going to be a blackout in 5 minutes. When it happens, stick with me. Don't run. Don't hesitate. Zara swallowed. A blackout? How? Cass cut her off. You ask too many questions. Minutes later, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the cell block, followed by the shouts of confused guards. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Cass grabbed Zara's arm and pulled her through the chaos. They moved fast, down the hallway, past the processing rooms, slipping through a back corridor normally used for maintenance workers. The guards were too distracted by the blackout to notice 2 figures moving in the dark. By the time they reached the infirmary, Zara's pulse was pounding. Cass yanked open a supply closet, revealing a pile of scrubs. Put these on, she ordered. Zara hesitated for only a second before stripping out of her jumpsuit and pulling on the loose-fitting uniform. Take this. Cass handed her an ID badge. You're a nurse. Act like one. Zara nodded, tugging a mask over her face just as a group of real hospital staff rushed by. Unaware of the imposter in their midst, Cass blended in effortlessly, leading the way toward the rear exit. Just as they reached the ambulance bay, Zara spotted the truck. A black pickup idled near the edge of the lot, its headlights off. Behind the wheel, a man sat motionless, watching. Raymond Carter. Zara moved toward it, every muscle in her body screaming for her to run. Then she heard the voice that made her blood turn to ice. Stop right there, Langston. He stood near the entrance, flanked by 3 officers. His expression was unreadable, but his hand hovered near his gun. Zara froze. The entire world seemed to narrow to that one moment, to the sheer weight of what was about to happen. Cass, standing beside her, barely moved, but her fingers flexed slightly. Zara realized she was inching toward her own weapon. Don't, Langston warned. His gaze shifted to Zara. You really think you're getting out of here? Zara said nothing. A sudden roar of an engine shattered the tension. The black pickup surged forward, its tires screeching against the pavement. Raymond, move, Cass shouted, shoving Zara forward. Zara sprinted, closing the distance just as Raymond threw the passenger door open. She barely had time to climb in before the truck peeled away, tires burning against the asphalt. Langston's men reacted a second too late. Gunshots cracked through the air, shattering the side mirror. Raymond swerved onto the highway, pushing the truck to its limits. The police cars weren't far behind. Zara braced herself against the seat. We're not losing them like this, she said. Raymond smirked. That's where you're wrong. He took a sharp exit, cutting into an unlit service road. The patrol cars followed, but Raymond knew the terrain. The truck bounced violently as they hit dirt, weaving through abandoned lots and back alleys. The patrol cars struggled to keep up. Then, suddenly, Raymond cut the headlights and veered down a side path. The police flew past, oblivious. Zara held her breath as they sat in the darkness, waiting. 1 minute, 2, then silence. They were gone. Raymond exhaled. Told you. Zara turned to him, still catching her breath. Who are you really? Raymond's jaw tensed. You don't get it yet, do you? He said. Langston isn't the problem. He never was. Zara frowned. What are you talking about? Raymond's grip tightened on the wheel. There's someone bigger pulling the strings. And they want you dead more than Langston ever did. Chapter 9. The man behind the curtain. The warehouse smelled of rust and old oil. The kind of place that had been abandoned long before Zara and Raymond found refuge in it. The metal roof rattled slightly in the wind, and the dim glow from a single overhead bulb cast long, distorted shadows against the cracked concrete floor. Zara sat on an overturned crate, wrapping her sore wrist with a torn piece of fabric she had found. Her body ached from the night's escape, but there was no time to rest. Across from her, Raymond crouched beside an old workbench, carefully prying open the metal casing of a battered external hard drive. She watched him work in silence before finally speaking. You said Langston isn't the real problem, she murmured. So who is? Raymond didn't look up. Langston's a pawn. He's useful because he's ruthless. But he's not calling the shots. Zara frowned. Then who is? Raymond exhaled sharply, setting down his tools. It's not one person. It's a network. Dirty cops, city officials, judges. Hell, even business owners. They keep each other protected. Make sure no one steps out of line. Langston runs Brooksville, but the people above him? They run everything else. Zara felt her stomach tighten. She had known corruption ran deep, but she hadn't realized just how far it spread. Raymond finally cracked open the casing and pulled out the hard drive. He held it up to the light, inspecting the damage. I took this from Langston's office years ago. Never got the chance to go through it before they came after me. Zara took the drive from him carefully. What's on it? If we're lucky? Proof. Raymond set up a laptop on the workbench, connecting the hard drive. The screen flickered to life, and folders began appearing, hundreds of them, neatly categorized. Zara leaned in, scrolling through the files. Jesus, she whispered. There were internal reports detailing use of force incidents, all buried under official police statements that claimed the victims had resisted arrest. Photos of injuries, names of officers who had been quietly transferred after misconduct complaints. Then, deeper in the drive, financial records, bank transactions, offshore accounts, a trail of money flowing between the police department and several well-connected individuals in City Hall. Zara's eyes locked onto one name in particular. Judge Alan Whitmore. She glanced at Raymond. The judge overseeing my case. He's on here. Raymond nodded grimly. Told you. It's all connected. Zara's mind raced. If she could get this out, publish it, make it public, it wouldn't just expose Langston. It would take down everyone protecting him. She reached for her phone. I need to send this to someone before they find us. She connected to a secure news platform, one of the few independent outlets that wouldn't bury the story. But as soon as she attempted to upload the files, the screen glitched. A red warning flashed. Connection lost. Her heart skipped. No, no, no. Raymond leaned over her shoulder, frowning at the screen. What happened? Zara's fingers flew over the keyboard, trying to reboot the connection. I think. The laptop froze. Then, one by one, the folders started disappearing. Someone was wiping the drive. Shit, she hissed. We've been hacked. Raymond's jaw tightened. They found us. A second later, the warehouse flooded with light. Engines roared outside, the sound of car doors slamming shut, the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. Raymond cursed under his breath, slamming the laptop shut. We have to move, now. Zara's pulse pounded in her ears as she grabbed the hard drive. Even though she knew it was useless now. They ran for the back exit just as voices shouted from the front. Zara Mitchell, Raymond Carter. Come out with your hands up. Langston. They burst through the back door, sprinting into the darkness. Gunshots rang out. Zara ducked, her breath coming in short gasps. She followed Raymond as he cut through the alley, vaulting over a rusted fence. They hit the pavement running, the sound of pursuit close behind. Zara had no idea where they were going, but Raymond seemed to. He led her through side streets, cutting through abandoned lots, until finally, the sounds of their pursuers faded into the distance. After what felt like forever, they reached an empty parking lot behind an old church. A single car waited there, its engine idling. Raymond slowed, breathing hard. This is the backup plan. Zara was too winded to argue. They climbed into the car, Raymond taking the wheel. As they pulled away, Zara finally allowed herself to believe they had escaped. Then she saw the figure standing under the streetlight ahead. Ethan Carter. Raymond cursed under his breath, slowing the car. Ethan took a step forward, raising a hand. Zara's relief was short-lived. The look on Ethan's face wasn't one of an ally. It was something else entirely. Chapter 10. The betrayal of an alley. The car's tires crunched against the pavement as Raymond brought it to a slow stop. Zara's breath hitched as she stared through the windshield at Ethan Carter, standing beneath the dim glow of the streetlight. His face was unreadable, but his posture told her everything. Hands loose at his sides, but his shoulders squared. He wasn't here as a friend. Raymond muttered under his breath. This isn't good. Zara's fingers curled against her knee. Let me handle this. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. Ethan took a step toward her, his expression heavy with something between regret and resignation. You shouldn't have run, Zara, he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. You're making this worse. Zara forced herself to keep her breathing steady. Worse for who? You or them? Ethan didn't flinch. There are things you don't understand. Raymond had followed her out of the car, his stance tense. Oh, we understand just fine, he said, his voice edged with anger. You sold her out. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. I didn't have a choice. Zara took a step closer. Everyone has a choice. For the first time, something flickered in Ethan's eyes, something almost like shame. He looked away, shaking his head. You think this is just about Langston? You think exposing him is going to change anything? The people protecting him have resources, power. They don't care about evidence. And they don't play fair. Zara's pulse pounded. So what? You're just going to let them win? Ethan looked at her then. And for the first time, she saw fear, not for himself, but for her. They already have, he said. You're alive right now because they think you might listen to reason. If you stop now, if you walk away, they'll let you disappear quietly. But if you keep pushing. Zara's voice was steel. I'm not stopping. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then they'll make sure you don't get another chance. Raymond let out a dry laugh. That sounds like a damn threat. Ethan's eyes flicked to Raymond, and something shifted. His hand moved toward his waist, too fast. Raymond reacted instantly, lunging toward him. A gunshot tore through the night. Zara's scream caught in her throat as Raymond staggered back, his body jerking from the impact. He dropped to his knees, his hand clutching his side as blood seeped through his fingers. Ethan's face twisted with something close to regret, but his gun was still raised. Zara moved without thinking. She lunged at him, but before she could reach him, a black SUV screeched to a stop beside them. Doors flew open. Hands grabbed her before she could fight back. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was Raymond collapsing onto the pavement, and Ethan turning away. Zara came to in the suffocating dark. Her head throbbed, Her wrists burned where the zip ties cut into her skin. The smell of gasoline and rust filled her nose. A warehouse. Footsteps echoed. She forced herself to focus. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows against the metal walls. And then she saw him. Langston. He stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her like she was a caged animal. "Took a lot of trouble to get you here," he said, his voice almost casual. "I was hoping you'd be smarter." Zara didn't answer. Her throat was dry, her body aching, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of fear. Langston crouched beside her, tilting his head. "You know what's funny? People like you always think they can win. Like the truth is some kind of weapon. Like it'll actually save you." He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her cheek. "The truth doesn't matter if no one's left to hear it." Zara swallowed hard. Langston straightened. "Accidents happen all the time. It's tragic. Really. Reporter dies in a fire. Or maybe a robbery gone wrong. Either way, you won't be around to argue." He turned to one of the men standing nearby. "Make it look clean." Zara's heart pounded. Then, just beyond the dim light, something caught her eye. A shadow moving where there shouldn't be one. A familiar silhouette. Cass Lopez. She was here. Chapter 11. Escape from the edge of death. Zara's wrists burned from the coarse rope digging into her skin. Her shoulders ached from hours of being bound to the chair. But she forced herself to stay still, to breathe through the pain. The metallic scent of old rust mixed with the faint stench of oil, making the air in the warehouse thick and suffocating. Langston stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed, like a man who had already won. He took his time, rolling up his sleeves, his gun resting casually on the table beside him. "You know, I was hoping you'd be smarter than this," he said, shaking his head. "You could have walked away, Zara. You could have kept that big city career, moved on to a new story. But you just had to keep digging." Zara's jaw tightened. "Because the truth matters." Langston let out a low chuckle. "The truth," he repeated, as if the word itself was amusing. "The truth is whatever the people in charge say it is. And the people I work for? They make sure that truth works in their favor." Zara's stomach twisted. "People like Judge Whitmore? The mayor?" Langston smirked. "You think small. The real power? They don't have to show their faces. They sit in private rooms, make the calls, fund the campaigns. You have no idea how deep this goes." Zara felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had suspected corruption, but this wasn't just about Brooksville. This was bigger. Something systematic, carefully constructed, untouchable. Langston leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'm going to make this simple. You leave town. You never publish a word. You disappear, and you get to keep breathing." She met his gaze, unflinching. "And if I don't?" His smirk faded. "Then you die tonight." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. One of his men stepped forward, gripping the back of her chair, dragging it closer to the center of the room. The floor beneath her was already stained, oil or something worse. A metal barrel sat a few feet away, its contents unknown, but Zara had a good guess. An accident, a fire, no body left to find. Langston exhaled, almost disappointed. "I really did like you. You know, shame it had to be this way." He reached for his gun. The shot came from outside. A single sharp crack of suppressed gunfire. Langston froze, his head snapping toward the door. His men tensed, reaching for their weapons. Then, chaos erupted. The lights flickered as a second shot rang out, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting the ground. Zara's pulse skyrocketed. Cass. She moved before she could think. The distraction was enough. Langston had turned toward the noise. Momentarily off guard, Zara rocked her chair, shifting her weight. The wooden frame wobbled, then crashed to the side. Pain shot up her arm, but she ignored it. Her fingers clawed at the rope, twisting her wrists against the binding. A third shot, a curse, someone shouting. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Cass. She moved like a shadow, fast and precise, taking down one of Langston's men with a blow to the throat before grabbing his gun. Zara's fingers found a sharp edge, a piece of glass from a shattered bottle. She gripped it tight, sawing at the rope. Langston spun back around, fury flashing in his eyes. "Stop her!" But it was too late. With one last desperate pull, Zara freed herself. She lunged, ramming the jagged glass into Langston's arm. He roared in pain, stumbling backward, blood seeping through his sleeve. Cass grabbed Zara's arm. Move. They sprinted toward the exit. One of Langston's men raised his gun. But Cass was faster. She fired first, sending him sprawling. The warehouse door slammed open, revealing the dark expanse of the lot outside. A truck sat idling nearby, its engine rumbling like an open invitation. Cass shoved Zara toward it. Get in. They barely made it inside before the gunfire started. Bullets tore through the night, shattering the rear window as Cass floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching. Zara twisted in her seat, catching a glimpse of Langston standing in the doorway, his injured arm hanging limp, his face twisted in pure rage. But he wasn't panicked. He wasn't scrambling to chase them. That unsettled her more than anything. Then, as they sped onto the main road, Zara's eyes flicked to the dashboard. Something small, blinking red. Her stomach dropped. A tracking device. Pull over, she gasped. Now. Cass didn't hesitate. She swerved the truck into a dirt path, grinding to a stop. Zara reached under the dash, fingers scrambling until they found it. A small black device, no bigger than a matchbox. Langston had known where they were all along. Her breath caught. He let us go. Cass paled. Then this isn't over. Chapter 12. Exposing the truth. Zara's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her breath coming in short, controlled exhales. The motel room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flickering laptop screen displaying a progress bar. The files from Raymond's hard drive, evidence of police brutality, corruption, and illegal financial dealings, were uploading onto a secure news server. Cass stood by the window, watching the parking lot below. A loaded pistol rested on the bedside table, a silent reminder of how quickly things could turn deadly. How much longer? Cass asked, her voice low. Zara checked the screen. Almost there. They had driven through the night to reach this town. A quiet, unassuming place just outside city limits. It was the safest option. Langston's reach hadn't completely extended here. Not yet. The moment the upload finished, Zara leaned back, letting out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It's done, she said. The files are out there. Cass nodded but didn't relax. Then we just pissed off the most powerful man in that town. The response came faster than either of them expected. Less than an hour later, Cass's burner phone vibrated against the table. She grabbed it, her expression darkening as she read the message. Arrest warrant issued for Zara Mitchell. Charges: conspiracy, domestic terrorism, obstruction of justice. Cass swore under her breath. He's going all in. Zara's stomach clenched. She had known Langston wouldn't go down quietly. But labeling her a terrorist? That was next level. It meant he wasn't just trying to silence her, he was making her a public enemy. Cass threw on her jacket. We need to move. Zara stood, already packing the laptop. Where to? The radio station. Zara hesitated. We just uploaded everything. What good will going on air do? Cass gave her a sharp look. Langston controls the system. He'll flood the media with lies before people even see the real evidence. We have to get ahead of it. If we can get on a live broadcast, tell people what's really happening, we might stand a chance. Zara exhaled. It was a long shot. But at this point, it was their only option. The local radio station was housed in an old brick building near the center of town. The parking lot was empty when they pulled in. But that didn't mean they were safe. Cass led the way inside, her hand hovering near her concealed weapon. The station's night host, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a coffee-stained shirt, looked up in confusion when they entered. You lost? He asked, barely glancing at them. Zara stepped forward. I need to go live. Right now. The man scoffed. Lady, this isn't a request line. You need. Cass reached into her pocket and tossed a flash drive onto the counter. This has evidence of police corruption that the whole country needs to hear. The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't reach for it. Zara leaned in, lowering her voice. Look me up, Zara Mitchell. They just labeled me a terrorist for telling the truth. If you don't believe me, give it a few minutes. They'll be knocking on your door soon enough. That got his attention. He grabbed his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then his face paled. Jesus, he muttered. You're everywhere. Zara nodded. Let me speak. Minutes later, she was seated in front of a microphone. Cass standing guard by the door. The on-air sign glowed red. Zara took a deep breath and started speaking. My name is Zara Mitchell, and if you're hearing this, I may not have much time left. The Brooksville Police Department, led by Sheriff Terry Langston, has spent years covering up crimes, silencing witnesses, and abusing power. I have the evidence to prove it. Right now, I am being hunted, not because I've broken the law, but because I dared to tell the truth. She glanced at Cass, who gave her a nod to continue. I've released files containing proof of these crimes. If you're listening, if you care about justice, don't let them bury this. Don't let them silence me like they've silenced so many others. The radio host's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the levels. Phones are lighting up, he muttered. But before Zara could say more, the signal cut. The station went dark. Cass reacted first. They found us. Move. Zara barely had time to grab the flash drive before Cass pulled her toward the back exit. Tires screeched outside. The first gunshot shattered the front window. Zara ducked as shards of glass rained down. Cass fired back, forcing their attackers to take cover. Zara's mind raced. If Langston had sent his men this fast, it meant he wasn't playing games anymore. Cass grabbed her wrist. We need to split up. They want you more than me. If you stay with me, they'll just keep coming. Zara hesitated, but she knew Cass was right. Where do I go? Cass tossed her a set of car keys. There's a truck parked 2 blocks down. Get to it. Drive west. I'll find you. Zara wanted to argue, but another round of gunfire forced her hand. She ran. By the time she reached the truck, her hands were shaking. She started the engine, gripping the wheel tightly as she pulled onto the main road. Her heart pounded. She was alone now, or so she thought, because her phone buzzed. A new message. No name, no number. It was a picture. Her mother's house. Then another. Her father's car parked in the driveway. A final message. Come home, or they won't wake up tomorrow. Zara's blood ran cold. She barely had time to react before a figure stepped out from the shadows. Langston. He stood in front of the truck, hands in his pockets, a slow smile spreading across his face. This time, there was no crowd, no witnesses, just the two of them. Chapter 13. The Final Battle. Zara's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she stared at Langston through the windshield. He stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable, but she could see it, the slight curve of his lips, the glint in his eyes. He was enjoying this. She glanced at her phone, the message still glaring on the screen. A picture of her parents' home. A warning. Langston took a step forward. Zara exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about her anymore. She opened the car door and stepped out. The cool night air pressed against her skin, but the heat of her rage burned hotter. Langston tilted his head slightly. Brave of you, he said. Most people would have run. Zara forced a smirk. Most people don't have your crimes sitting in the hands of every journalist in the country. Langston chuckled. Cute, but you and I both know the system doesn't work that way. You think a few news stories will bring me down? The people I work for, they own the narrative. He took another step closer. Zara held her ground. Maybe, she admitted, but they don't own me. Langston sighed, almost disappointed. You always had potential, Zara. Could have been useful, but you just wouldn't let things go. His hand moved. Zara barely saw the gun before it was pointed at her. A sleek, black silencer glinted under the streetlight. You made a mess, Langston said. I'm here to clean it up. Zara's mind raced. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to finish what he started. She needed time. You sure you want to do this? She asked, stalling. Shoot me in the street? It's a little sloppy for someone as meticulous as you. Langston smirked. You think I haven't planned for this? Accidents happen all the time. He took another step closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. Then the door behind Zara burst open. Gunfire erupted. Zara hit the ground, rolling behind the truck as bullets tore through the air. The sharp scent of gunpowder filled her lungs as she scrambled for cover. Cass. She had come. From her position, Zara could see Langston taking cover behind a parked car, returning fire. His men, 3 of them, were scattered, trying to flank Cass. Zara's heart pounded. She had seconds to act. A body lay near her. A man Langston had brought. His gun was just within reach. She lunged for it. The cold metal fit perfectly in her hands. She rose to her knees, took aim, and fired. The shot clipped one of Langston's men in the leg. He crumpled with a sharp cry. Cass took advantage of the distraction, moving fast, her shots precise. Zara's breath came fast and sharp as she moved around the truck, keeping her sights on Langston. She caught him just as he tried to slip away. "Drop it," she ordered. Langston turned, his gun still in hand. "You're not going to shoot me," he said, smirking. Zara's finger hovered over the trigger. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to end it, to put an end to this nightmare. But that wasn't justice. She wasn't him. "On your knees," she ordered instead. Langston exhaled, then, to her shock, laughed. "You think you've won?" he asked, almost amused. "You really think this ends with me?" Zara's stomach tightened. "I was never the biggest player," Langston said. "I'm just the one stupid enough to get caught." He dropped his gun. Sirens filled the air. Cass stepped beside Zara as red and blue lights flashed down the street. Cops poured in, but they weren't here for Zara. One of them approached, gun trained on Langston. "Hands where we can see them." Langston raised his hands, turning back to Zara one last time. "You don't get it yet, do you?" he murmured. "You just cracked the door open. Now they know your name." Zara felt a chill run down her spine. Langston was led away, his smirk never fading. She should have felt victorious. But then her phone buzzed. A single message. "You've made enemies. Watch your back." Chapter 14. A hollow victory. Zara sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching as Langston stood before the judge. His orange jumpsuit looked out of place on him, as if he still believed himself above all this. His expression was calm, almost bored, as if he had already made peace with whatever was coming next. The judge shuffled some papers before looking up. In light of the evidence presented, he began, his tone devoid of emotion. "This court finds the defendant, Terry Langston, guilty of obstruction of justice, falsifying reports, and conspiracy to commit assault." A murmur rippled through the room. Zara's grip on the armrest tightened. Langston barely reacted. The judge continued, "The court hereby sentences the defendant to 8 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 3 years. Zara's heart sank. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped. Others whispered angrily. A few reporters at the back of the room exchanged looks, already preparing their headlines. 3 years. After everything. Langston turned slightly, locking eyes with her. Then he smirked. Zara's stomach twisted. After the sentencing, reporters swarmed outside the courthouse. Some shouted questions, while others simply observed, their cameras capturing every movement. "Zara, how does it feel to bring down Brooksville's most powerful officer? Do you believe the sentence was fair? Are you worried about retaliation?" She ignored them all. Cass walked beside her, silent, her jaw clenched. She had already received the news. Her suspension from the force had turned into permanent termination. Officially, it was due to violating procedure. Unofficially, it was a warning to anyone else thinking of doing what she had done. Raymond had vanished. No official record of his whereabouts. Some said he had left the country. Others believed he was hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike back. As for Ethan Carter, the man who had betrayed her, his name had quietly disappeared from all reports. No indictment, no reprimand, just gone. Rumors swirled. Whispers of him being reassigned to a position in Washington, protected by the very system he had helped uphold. Zara had exposed Langston, but the machine was still running. The days that followed were a blur of media coverage, interviews, and online debates. Some hailed her as a hero, a journalist who had risked everything to uncover the truth. Others saw her as a troublemaker, someone who had blown things out of proportion and turned the town against itself. Brooksville was different now. The protests outside the police station hadn't stopped. There were calls for reform, for deeper investigations, but there were also those who wanted things to go back to the way they were, where people didn't ask questions, where the status quo remained untouched. Zara knew one thing: she couldn't stay here. Not when the real fight was just beginning. She packed her bag in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. Cass sat on the bed, watching. "You sure about this?" Zara zipped up her duffel. "I didn't come this far just to stop at Langston." Cass exhaled, rubbing her temple. "You do realize whoever's pulling the strings, they won't just sit back and watch you dig?" "I know," Zara said. "That's why I have to." Cass was quiet for a long moment before finally nodding. "Then I hope you know what you're walking into." Zara didn't, but she had to walk into it anyway. As she reached the front door, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A message. She hesitated before opening it. A photo. It showed a group of men and women in suits, standing in a marble hallway. Their faces were sharp, professional, unreadable. Below it, a single line of text. "They're the ones you should fear." Zara stared at the screen. The real fight hadn't even begun. Chapter 15. The silence before the storm. Zara had spent years chasing the truth. But now, the truth was chasing her. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in front of her. But she wasn't really seeing it. Her mind was elsewhere, on the eerie stillness that had settled over Brooksville since Langston's arrest. It felt wrong. The protests had quieted, the outrage had dulled, people had returned to their routines. But there was an unease beneath it all, like the entire town was waiting for something. Her phone buzzed for the third time that morning. Another unknown caller, another voicemail she wouldn't bother checking. She had stopped answering 2 days ago when the same robotic voice had started repeating the same chilling message. "Walk away while you still can." Her stomach twisted as she reached for her laptop. She hesitated before opening it, already knowing what she'd find. Her bank accounts were frozen. Every single one. Her credit cards? Declined. Her phone? Probably tapped. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay calm. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was cutting off her options, boxing her in. And then there was Cass. Or rather, the absence of her. Cass had disappeared. Her last text had been 2 nights ago. A simple, laying low, "Be careful." Since then, nothing. Zara had called. No answer. Had driven by her place. Empty. Had checked every usual contact. No one had seen her. Her pulse pounded as she scrolled through the news, scanning for anything about missing persons, about cops gone rogue, anything. And that's when she saw it. Not about Cass, but about someone else. Daniel Hayes, a journalist Zara had worked with in the past, a man who had helped her leak police reports, had put his name on stories when hers had become too risky. Now, he was missing. The article was brief, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, just gone, like he had never existed. Zara's fingers clenched around her phone. First Cass, now Hayes. Someone was tying up loose ends. She was still processing when the knock came. Sharp, urgent. Zara grabbed the pistol from the kitchen drawer before moving to the door. She pressed herself to the side, keeping her body out of sight as she peered through the peephole. Ethan Carter. Her chest tightened. The last time she had seen him, he had betrayed her, chosen survival over doing what was right. And yet, he looked different now. His tie was gone, his shirt untucked, his face was pale, his eyes darting like a man who had seen too much, who had realized, too late, that he was on the wrong side of something he couldn't escape. He knocked again. "Zara, I know you're in there," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk, now." She hesitated, then unlocked the door and let him in. Ethan moved fast, shutting the door behind him, checking the windows, lowering his voice. "You need to leave," he said. Zara folded her arms. "You're going to have to be a little more specific." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They know where you are. They've been watching. I don't know how much time you have before they move on you. But it won't be long." She studied him. "Who's they?" Ethan hesitated. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a thick manila folder, and placed it on the table between them. Langston was never the one in charge, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was a tool, a distraction. Zara stared at the folder. It looked unremarkable, but something in Ethan's face made her hesitate before touching it. His hands trembled slightly. He wasn't just warning her. He was afraid. Zara finally reached for it, flipping it open. Pages of documents, names, transactions, surveillance photos, powerful men in suits, government officials, business leaders, people who shouldn't be in the same room together, yet there they were. She turned the page, her breath catching at the sight of one name in particular. Judge Alan Whitmore, the man who had given Langston a slap on the wrist. Her fingers clenched the paper. What is this? Ethan swallowed hard. It's why you need to run. Zara's pulse pounded. You're telling me this now? After everything? Ethan's jaw tightened. Because I didn't know how bad it was until now. Zara's gaze dropped back to the papers. The pieces were falling into place. Langston wasn't the problem. He was just the beginning. She exhaled sharply, shoving the folder back toward him. Then help me. Ethan shook his head. No one can help you now. Zara frowned. So what? You came here just to scare me? Ethan hesitated, then took a step closer, lowering his voice. Zara, don't read it. Her stomach twisted. You think you've exposed them. Ethan continued, but all you did was make them look at you. And once you see too much, there's no way out. Zara held his gaze. Then I guess I better start running. Ethan exhaled, defeated. God help you. He turned and left. Zara stared at the folder. Then, slowly, she reached for the next page. Chapter 16. The fight isn't over. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, dark and empty except for the faint glow of distant headlights. Zara kept her hands steady on the wheel, the weight of the past few weeks pressing into her chest like a slow, suffocating grip. She wasn't running. She was preparing. Brooksville was behind her now. But the fight had never been about just one town. It had never been about Langston alone. She glanced at the manila folder on the passenger seat, the edges worn from where her fingers had gripped it too tightly. Ethan's words still echoed in her mind. You don't get it. You've made yourself a target. She did get it, and she wasn't stopping. At the next rest stop, Zara pulled in and killed the engine. The neon lights from the gas station flickered overhead as she reached for the folder. Flipping it open once more. Inside, the names stretched across the pages, each one carrying the weight of decades of corruption. Law enforcement officials, judges, CEOs, and then, her breath caught. Governor William Aldridge, the man currently running for the U.S. Senate, a politician who had built his campaign on promises of justice and reform. Shaking hands with activists, standing on podiums declaring that no one is above the law. Yet here he was, buried deep in the same network that had protected Langston. She exhaled sharply, staring at his name. This wasn't just a local scandal. This was national. Her phone vibrated, pulling her from her thoughts. A message. She opened it. Cass, I can't keep in touch. They're watching me. Be careful. Zara swallowed hard. She had expected this. Cass had risked everything to help her. Now, she was paying the price. Zara shut her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply before reaching for her laptop. She set it on the dashboard, opening a new document, a blank page, a new beginning. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she started typing. The truth they won't tell you. She paused, watching the words appear on the screen. Then, her inbox pinged. An email. No sender. No subject. She clicked it open. One sentence. If you keep going, you'll be next. Zara stared at the screen. Then, slowly, she closed the email and kept typing. The truth is a dangerous thing. For those who control the system, it's not about justice, it's about power. Zara uncovered one piece of the puzzle. But the game is far from over. How many more secrets are buried beneath corruption? And how far would you go to expose them? This isn't just a story. It's a reflection of the world we live in. What would you do if the truth made you a target? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge everything you think you know, hit subscribe. Covert Truths. Because some secrets were never meant to stay hidden.